Back in 2022, we connected with Harry Moser of the Reshoring Initiative to discuss supply chain strategies and the megatrends we saw heading into 2032. And a lot has changed since then. So there's record levels of reshoring, there's new policy shifts, including tariffs, and of course, new evolving technologies like AI. And these are all presenting fresh challenges for manufacturers. So today we're picking up from that 2022 conversation to look at what's actually happened, what surprised us both, and what leaders should focus on now. Harry brings decades of manufacturing and reshoring expertise and is recognized multiple times by his industry peers for his work. He's been inducted into the Industry Manufacturing Hall of Fame in 2010. He was named Quality Magazine's Professional of the Year for 2012. He participated in 2012 insourcing forums at the White House. He won the 2013 Economist Debate on Outsourcing and Offshoring, and he received the Manufacturing Leadership Council's Industry Advocacy Award in 2014. And most recently, the Association for Manufacturing Technology presented Harry Moser with its prestigious Albert W. Moore AMT Leadership Award. So in this conversation, we'll explore the latest reshoring data, the roles of tools like total cost of ownership. You'll hear some terms called foreign direct investment, or FDI. We'll talk about the human side of change and how companies can best prepare for automation and technologies, and especially AI. We talked a lot about the human side of change. And when I asked him about what the Reshoring Initiative can provide to U.S. manufacturers, his first response was hope. So if you lead in manufacturing, supply chain, or operations, this conversation's for you. Harry, welcome to the conversation.
Jon, it's great to be back.
Yeah, thank you so much for making time. I'm really grateful that you did. So let's talk a little bit about your career in manufacturing and the mission of the Reshoring Initiative and how that journey over the years has changed your perspective on U.S. manufacturing and the strengths and challenges that you see organizations need to have today.
So I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is just south of Newark.
Yeah.
My ancestors in 1670 settled the area. They were amongst the first European settlers of New Jersey. In the summers, I worked for Singer Sewing Machine there, which had its world biggest plant, the biggest factory of any kind in the world, 3 million square feet, 5,000 workers. So it'd be a big factory today. And my dad ran a third of it. His father was a foreman. And I went past 20 years ago, and nothing's made there anymore of Singer, that they import as far as I can tell, everything they sell in the U.S. is imported from low-wage countries.
Yeah.
And so that had a big impact on the city, on the state, on the country. And I saw the same thing happening, as I moved ahead. I went to MIT, I worked for GE, I worked for Diesematic selling foundry equipment,
Yeah.
Acme Cleveland selling CNC machine tools, multiple spindle bar and trucking machines, and company after company, industry after industry I wanted to sell to went out of business because they were wiped out by cheap imports.
Yeah.
And so I felt the pain as U.S. went from being clearly the dominant manufacturer in the world to this gradual decline for the last 40, 50 years, and retired eventually from Charmy. That was my best job. I was the president of Charmy, which is EDM and high-speed milling machines, now called United Machining. Founded the nonprofit Reshoring Initiative, whose mission is to balance the goods trade. So right now we have a $1.3 trillion deficit. So our mission is to increase U.S. manufacturing by 40%, which is what would be required to get balance. So imagine 40% more output, 40% more workers that we don't have, 50% annual capital investment in capital and equipment would go up by 50% and stay there forever to maintain that higher level of output. It'd be an entirely different country. It would be the kind of country that we had in probably the 50s and the 60s, when things were booming. The kind of things that wiped us out, from my opinion, that hurt so much. First, the U.S. dollar in 1985 went up about 70, 80% within a year or two. And all of a sudden, U.S. companies that had been world leaders, all of a sudden they couldn't compete.
Yeah.
And if they tried to compete on price with the machine tools coming in from Japan, then their margins got so low they couldn't do the R&D and D and they couldn't innovate.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So it was a very challenging time, and some cases it was the company's own fault. They didn't innovate soon enough. They weren't organized enough. But a lot of it was this sort of macroeconomic challenges. And also, we have a lack of skilled workforce, where the Germans and so on still had these excellent apprentice programs.
Yeah.
We let ours go to hell because there were enough people somehow, and everything sort of worked out, and therefore we didn't have the quantity and quality of skilled workforce that we needed. The U.S. was too short-term oriented. Everything was about making money, making the quarter, instead of doing the long-term investments that, say, a German or a Swiss would do. And every year they'd buy a couple of CNC machine tools, so they'd always have the best. And the U.S. company would too often make do with what they had because they weren't busy enough and weren't profitable enough.
Right.
So
Right.
I saw some tough times. I personally came through it fine, but I was maybe in the right places.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're saying there resonates with me a bit because, being in supply chain and procurement in the 2000s and being a development engineer previously, the mode of operating was really to get in your car and go see the suppliers, and then the outsourcing decisions started to happen, and I lost track of the number of, small 50-person companies that closed their doors. And it's a very disheartening thing to kind of go through and experience. And I know the Reshoring Initiative in particular really wants to, change that in a big way. So I think that that's really a great mission that you're on for sure.
Well, I'm pleased.
Yeah. Well, cool. So we'll recap a little bit of our 2022 conversation. And so we wanted to look at like a big multi-year picture, multi-year horizon, and we talked about things about TCO, total cost of ownership, and supply chain shortages that we were seeing at the time. And so, give some examples of what's happened kind of historically in the reshoring initiatives and the data sets that you've kind of seen. And I know you've got some case stories as well that you'd like to talk about a little bit, and how lean thinking and supply chain approaches really help with total cost of ownership.
Yeah. So one of my favorite recent cases is GE appliances. And somebody may say, well, they're not reshoring their FDI, foreign direct investment, because now they were bought by Haier, I think it's a Chinese appliance company back 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Uh-huh.
But in the last years, they've invested around 6.5 billion of additional investments, new factories, thousands of workers hired, hundreds of millions of dollars of additional purchases from domestic supply chains. So they're impacting both the factory, the big company, but also the hundreds of supply companies all over the country, and doing just a great job. And they've become the number one appliance maker in the United States because of their aggressive, but both a combination of investment, commitment, lean. So there've been several articles on them by the Lean Enterprise Institute, Jim Womack, and that group. And I know Jim's been down there a couple of times. And so they've applied lean, they've automation, commitment, total cost of ownership. They were the one of the winners of the National Metalworking Reshoring Award last year. So just a nice relationship with them. Delighted to have them doing what we hope more companies will do. Right?
Yeah.
So they're one of my favorite. You mentioned just in time. I was speaking at an AMA, Association for Manufacturing Excellence. That's the lean organization. So I was speaking at their annual event, and the topic came up: is just in time over? Because of the disruptions and so on. Are we all going to have massive inventories again? And the question was, had we over leaned? Had we gotten too lean on the inventory? And I said, no, we under leaned. Everybody else said, yeah. I said, no, we've under leaned because the lack of inventory only hurt because we were dependent on shipments from halfway around the world that took 6 weeks to get here.
Yeah.
as opposed to having things coming in from 200 miles away where it takes 3 hours or 4 hours to get here.
Right.
And so, no, we haven't gone too lean. We haven't gone lean enough because if you go back to the basic principles of lean, one of the principles is to look at total cost of ownership instead of just at price. And when you do that, the pieces start to fall into place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the big observations I had in my career path was that in the supply chain procurement realm, we would do those TCO models. And once you put in 6 weeks of time for the material to arrive, many times, 90% of them, it was always a wash, right? And so yet these decisions were made to push the manufacturing overseas. And just on the face of it, right, it isn't lean to have something built overseas when you've got local manufacturers that can support it. They're just a few hundred miles away. And it just makes a lot more rational sense to localize and source locally, for sure. For sure.
And basically what it shows is the impact of using total cost. And total cost by definition again is you start with the FOB or ex-works price here and there, and you
Yeah.
add in duty, freight, packaging, carrying cost of inventory, all these items. And so if you the blue line here represents the China price as a percentage of the US, that's the horizontal axis.
Yep.
China ex-works price, percentage of US ex-works price. The red line is total cost of ownership, so it's price plus 29 other factors, and the yellow line is total cost, but with a 15% tariff thrown in, and China is actually more like a 25 or a 50% tariff.
Yeah.
And so the key thing is to look at the numbers in the lower right-hand corner. So based on price, the U.S. wins 8% of the time. Based on total cost, 32%.
Yeah.
And if there's a 15% tariff, then 46% of the time. So just by doing the math correctly, the U.S. win rate goes from 8% to 46%. I mean, that's what Obama did to get the work back was give out hundreds of billions of dollars. So what Trump's done has been disruption from tariffs and so on. And they each have their own place and maybe were good decisions. But if I could just get all the companies to consistently use total cost to reward their procurement people based on decisions based on total cost, we'd have gotten more results than we got from all the money that was spent.
Yeah. It makes a lot of rational sense to definitely do it in that fashion for sure. So another kind of question here is, what were you, when 2022 we talked about total cost of ownership, it's hard to remember back, but we were going through a pandemic at that time, right? We were in the throes of, 2 years into the pandemic, and there were a number of challenges that we had. But what have you been most surprised about over the last, 4 years or so since we talked last? What elements were a big surprise for you?
Okay, so surprises. First, I was surprised that Biden's subsidies were so much, 100 billion or hundreds of billions of dollars. And Trump's tariffs, I could predict them from his first term, but that they were so uncertain, so unpredictable. Huh?
Yeah.
But they both had an impact on reshoring. The Biden's was quite immediate. When you hand a company $1 billion or $2 billion, they announce a new factory,
Right.
because they want to get the money, and so there's been and Trump's, the actual results of tariffs have been rather impressive, and the media says no, but partially that's because especially when you have these $2 billion factories that are going to employ 1,000 people, from the date you announce them until the factory's open and you're hiring people is 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah.
And so Trump, when he sold the whole thing, he didn't warn people, have patience. I'm doing the right thing. But by the time I'm out of here, you'll see it was right. He wanted them to believe today, and yet so the media and too many voters now, I think, don't have the patience to wait and see that it is playing out and probably will play out. And that's not to defend tariffs. Tariffs are not my best policy, but it's doing better than the media would suggest. Now, one thing that I guess played out about it as I'd expect, the many of the gurus and famous economists still rigidly hold to the belief that reshoring is impossible,
Hmm.
and that advanced countries, especially the U.S., should give up on those old-fashioned habits of making things. Let the poor people in those other poor countries do that, and we can do podcasts, and we can do consulting for our friends, and we can do nonprofit organizations, and do trade securities with each other, and do things like that, and it will be just fine. And what slide number 2 shows is it to some extent refutes the old concept that countries, as they get rich, will inevitably leave behind manufacturing, go from agriculture to manufacturing to services. So this chart, the darkness of the color, it relates to the percentage of employment that's in manufacturing. And you can see U.S. is one of the lightest shades, under 10% of employment is manufacturing. And many of our peer countries, the France, Italy, Spain, Japan, South Korea, have manufacturing employment that's substantially higher than ours. Where ours is 8 or 9%, most of those are 12 or 13%. And 12 or 13 is about 40% more than 8 or 9. So they're right about where I think we should be, because that would balance our trade deficit. And Germany has about 20 or 22% manufacturing in its workforce. And these countries are strong economically, they've done well. And so there's no iron law of economics that says that we should stop doing manufacturing, we should give all that stuff up, we should just do services. The best proof that we can do better is that so many countries are doing better.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of tools, technology, right? Policy and the trade, all of those elements kind of coming together and working. And I think also something that's missing is there's a lot of joy in just making stuff,
Exactly. Yeah.
And
But I think, there's one of I think Michael Pettis is a famous commentator, political scientist, economist, and he said the U.S. has to decide under whose industrial policy we will exist. Because if we don't have our own industrial policy, then we're living under the industrial policy impacts of China, Germany, Mexico, et cetera. So either accept that and accept the fact they're going to lower their currencies, they're going to have good skilled workforces, they're going to do all these things, and if we don't do any of those things and just get buffered, get hit by the impacts of what they do, well then suck it in and don't complain about what you're doing. So he said, decide whose industrial policy you're going to live under, and he suggested we should have our own, and do the things that are good for our country. And to me, that's obvious.
yeah, it's kind of same here that I think it's a real good thing to build up the local employment and reduce the transit times for materials and things like that, and do as much as you can as close as you can is an ideal way to do that for sure.
Yep.
For sure.
Now, speaking of close as you can, you mentioned before the impact of short delivery, short supply chains.
Yeah.
In our 2025 reshoring survey, we asked companies, how much more would you pay for 1 week delivery as opposed to 6 week deliveries? And about 40% of the companies said they would pay between 5 and 20% more for the short delivery than the longer delivery, presumably because of less inventory carrying costs, less likely to stock out, fewer emergency air freight shipments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the companies intrinsically know that makes sense, and yet they still have boatloads of stuff going over.
Yeah.
And it's either because they're not smart enough to figure it out, or the logical U.S. suppliers haven't been smart enough to convince them to change their mind.
Yeah, and organizational culture has a big play in there, and internal accounting rules, believe it or not. So I've seen that in which freight and logistics is a different bucket that doesn't roll into the cost roll up, and And that sometimes forces the procurement and supply chain folks to be in a kind of no-win position, right? That what's within their ERP systems from an acquisition cost is really not representative of all of what goes into that, and not to mention a lot of the outsourcing and offshoring activities. There's a longer play where you have quality issues and performance issues, and then the aggregate team is spending a ton of time addressing all of that, and those types of costs aren't really captured, in comparison to something that's 100 miles away, as an example, for
Yeah,
sure.
I know people who are salesmen for job shops, and they'll call on a company they used to make things for, and they say, "Hey, I'd like to make those widgets for you again." And the buyer says, "Well, we're getting them from China, and they're 30% less. If you can match that price, you can have it." And the salesman says, "Well, I hear you've got warranty issues, too much inventory, stockouts.
Yeah.
How about that?" And the procurement guy says, "Those aren't in my budget. Those are in somebody else's budget."
Exactly. Right. And so that holistic kind of systemic view just isn't in most organizations from a maturity level perspective, really, to look at
No,
all those items. For sure. For sure.
but it could be.
It should be, I think. Yeah.
Should
Definitely
be.
should
Yeah,
be.
and companies that want to make the right decisions have to do the math correctly.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Let's take a look now kind of at what's happening with the reshoring data in particular. And I'll bring up your next slide here. But, what are you seeing from a trends perspective, and what has kind of happened over the last 4 years? And from what I can tell, there's some good news here.
Yeah, the we track two trends. One is reshoring by U.S. headquartered companies, think General Motors, and the other is FDI, foreign direct investment. So
Okay.
foreign headquartered companies, think Toyota. But both of them, if they invest here and hire here, they're deciding to make it here instead of somewhere else.
Right.
And so this chart shows the trend from 2010 when I founded the Reshoring Initiative, and then it was 11,000 in that year. Peaked in 2017 with the tax and regulatory cuts of Trump, a lot of enthusiasm. Fell off with his trade war that we started to participate in at the time. Picked up with Biden's subsidies,
Hmm.
chips, batteries, etc. Then fell off as that money started to run out, but not too bad. Still quite a good level, 200,000 plus a year. And so far, 2026 projected based on May's numbers, so annualized based on January,
Yeah.
338,000, just about tied with the previous record, despite the uncertainty caused by the chaotic announcements of the tariffs, despite the fact that there's maybe 40 or 50 companies we've identified that have announced or talked about big projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, but have not identified a location or a product, haven't bought the land, and
Hmm.
until they do those things, we don't include them in the data
Okay.
because you may remember a case of Foxconn
Yeah.
up in Wisconsin that was going to have 14,000 people, and they bought a bunch of land, and I think they had 400 people at the max, and so we don't want to get caught with including that in the numbers and then having to back it out later. So
Yeah.
we wait until there's shovels in the ground before we include them in the data.
Yeah. So that's great. It's not just based on a press release. That's good.
Well, if the press release says we bought the land, we're buying the equipment, and we got $2 billion, and the state has signed a contract to give us 200 million and do it, yeah, that's enough. But
Yeah.
when it's all wishy-washy and maybe someday, then we wait to get more solid.
Okay. So in looking at the chart, I mean, one of the questions, you did a really nice job understanding the dips over the last couple of years. So are we at a point to say that if it's projected at 338,000 plus for this year, that tariffs might have been the impetus to jumpstart that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, we've analyzed we for each case that we find and we put in our database in our library, we have maybe 30 different factors that were perhaps mentioned in the article, the press release, whatever you, because geopolitics, freight costs, whatever. For the last 2 or 3 years, one item's been tariffs, and the tariffs are still not the most mentioned. You know, the number one is we love the people here in Tennessee. They're the hardest working, best people you could find anywhere. You know what I mean? That they have to say when they do the press release.
Sure.
But the rate of mention of tariffs, I think, was up 14 times from 24 to 26.
Okay.
So it went up much faster than anything else went up. And I think there's a certain tendency for people not to give the reason of tariffs, because with tariffs changing every hour or every week, and you say we're doing it, and a major reason is a tariff, and then the tariffs go away, then a logical observer would say, well, then are you going to cancel the factory?
Yeah.
And I say, so you'd like to build your factory on a solid foundation that you know is going to be there for the duration.
Yeah, and so I think we were talking about that, the whipsaw of the policy dynamics, and I think I said, hey, it would be great if they were consistent for a week, and you suggested, a few days would be really good, right, to have that consistency.
If he'd come out and had moderate, like 15% tariffs on everybody, plus 50% on China, and announced it like that, and then stuck to it, and gotten everybody to sign up in the first month, instead of this back and forth and putting it on political reasons. I think last year would have been 100,000 higher, and this year would be 100,000 higher.
Okay. Yeah. So the big takeaway there is just consistency in the policy and sticking to your guns.
Because good policy, decent policies, and some kind of policies,
Sure.
and then be consistent and stable on them.
Yeah.
Now, like one of the problems, the companies still that have said that they're going to go ahead because of the tariffs, often they'll say, but if the tariffs aren't here, the factory's not going to be here. In many cases, they're saying we can do this if there's a 15% tariff on Mexico or wherever, we're coming. But part of the problem is Trump has done everything sort of his own decision, and if in the beginning, if he had gotten Congress to approve the tariffs, then it would have been locked in. The next president couldn't just write them off again. That it had to get Congress to overrule it again, which would be tough to do. Yeah. And so I think he should have, maybe he couldn't, but I think he should have gone to Congress, gotten their approval, and built a more solid foundation for the whole project.
Yeah, and so what we might be able to kind of forecast ahead is there's a scenario then that it could whipsaw again with a different administration.
Or even midterms.
Yeah.
They could rule. They could say the tariffs are all gone.
Yeah, which would again cause a lot of uncertainty for the manufacturing, folks that are paying attention and trying to figure out what to do for sure.
So one thing to note: the reshoring started in the southeast. Right to work, wages not quite as high, lower land prices, lower taxes, better subsidies, and all kinds of good reasons. More enthusiasm. Spread out as far as Arizona. Arizona's gotten a huge amount of chips, for example. Taiwan Semiconductor. Moved up through Texas has gotten a lot. Then moved up through Tennessee, Kentucky, all the way up to Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, even out in New York State, which is traditionally a pretty tough place to be competitive. Some huge chip factories in New York State, IBM doing some things. So it's done a nice job. It tends to ignore the West Coast.
Yeah.
Tends to ignore the Northeast, but hits the South and the Midwest.
Gotcha. No, that's good to know. So, what else have you seen from just global events and other things in this regard? The tariffs, incentives, trade agreements, other supply disruptions that you've seen?
But I think the U.S. is still the biggest market in the world.
Okay.
we were by far the biggest market 40, 50 years ago, and now we're still just the biggest. And so countries may be displeased with Trump and displeased with the tariffs, but they and their companies know that if they're going to succeed, they have to sell here.
Yeah.
Okay, so we still have sort of the whip hand in that sense, and the companies and the countries are willing to flex, are willing to work with us to make it happen. I think when they're in private, I think they have to recognize that a 1.3 trillion trade deficit is unsustainable.
Yeah.
And if not that many politicians think about the long term, but if they do, they've got to say, hey, should I be willing to give up a little bit of advantage relative to the U.S. now so that the U.S. will stay as such a big market rather than eventually collapse? Because my belief is if we don't do something about it, if we continue to have $2 trillion budget deficits and our debt now exceeds 100% of GDP, dangerous position, and we have $1.4 trillion trade deficits, and you keep piling those two on top of each other, eventually the dollar's going to collapse. Eventually, our interest rates are going to skyrocket, and the country could be in a serious mess. And so I think our people are smart enough to see it's better to take some actions now, and I think the foreign countries and companies see the same thing. Working with us a bit is better now than catastrophe for everybody later on.
Right. Try to prepare for the future and put the right groundwork in place for it.
The Chinese would probably rather we went belly up.
Yeah, fair point for sure. So, one of the other themes that we wanted to talk about a bit was just managing change when it comes to things in procurement and supply chain and manufacturing. And so we do a lot of change management work here, understanding strategy and culture and in order to do an initiative and transformation. So what are your perspectives on some of the change management skills that, whether you're a small business, mid-market, privately held, or publicly traded, and you've got a manufacturing footprint, what are some of the leadership skills that are needed for good change management when it comes to TCO and reshoring?
I'd say it eliminates silos. Everybody's known for years that silo is good for grain, but it's not good for manufacturing. And so you have the procurement department making this decision based on price, and everybody else is complaining about the impact of that, but the procurement gets away with it, and they're getting bonuses for it, kind of.
Right.
So that's a mistake. Longer term perspectives that companies have to look at the impacts for the next. Like the Chinese. The Chinese have their 5-year plans, and I know their 25-year plans, and we're getting ready for the quarterly earnings kind of thing. And,
right.
And as a nation, we turn over administrations and parties every 2 years or 4 years, and all of a sudden we're going in different directions, and they're continuing along, and they've done wonderfully because of it. I read material from one book that compared the two countries and said one reason China has a better innovation, growth, manufacturing competitiveness is because back when things really got going, maybe 10, 15 years ago, all of the 9 members of the Politburo were engineers. Mm-hmm. Whereas in U.S., typically we have maybe 1 senator and 6 congressmen who are engineers, and half or more are lawyers.
Yeah.
So if you want a system that's well designed and runs well, you're probably better off with an engineer than, or at least have maybe 50-50 or something like that.
Yeah, no, those are good insights for sure. That the policy is definitely challenging, and then the short-term versus long-term focus, that just everybody feels that pressure here for sure.
Another thing that I often come back to is the business roundtable. Mm-hmm. So back maybe 10 years ago, they came out with a redefinition of the purpose of a corporation. And prior to that, shareholders was the stakeholder. The only thing that mattered was maximizing for shareholders. And they said, no, yes, shareholders are still stakeholders, but also employees, community, and suppliers. Then if you don't take care of all those, eventually your company's going to be in hot water, and you're not being moral and responsible. And yet too many of our companies still look only at the share price and not looking at the societal impacts of what they do.
Yeah, the ecosystem of everything the organization touches. That's a better mindset, it would seem to me.
Yeah, and it's what, if 95, if all the companies except my company were being good Boy Scouts, I could probably get away with cheating, so to speak, self-maximizing. But when everybody does that, then the commons, the ecosystem, the whole starts to degrade and collapse. And then, for most U.S. companies, by far their biggest market is the United States. And if the U.S. market is declining, then they're going to decline. No matter what they do, they're going to decline. And they can't sell enough in China to make up for it because there's 5 Chinese companies that have stolen their technology. They're going to beat them out over there.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially with the help of the government. So it's in the interest of companies to take care of their home.
Yeah, no, that's a good perspective for sure. So let's hop into the topic of workforce development.
So in our 2025 survey, we asked companies, what would it take to get you to bring back a significant percentage of what you now import? And we got good responses for lower taxes, deregulation, tariffs, lower currency, but we got the highest response for having the quality and quantity of workforce that's required. So the companies say, give me the workforce and we'll bring the work back. And then you say, well, why don't we have the workforce? And I think a lot of the problem is the Department of Labor. Back about 14 years ago, they invited me down to DC to tell them how to get the workforce ready for reshoring. And so I'm in the Secretary of Labor's conference room, and I said, well, first, we got to get the Department of Labor to stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution. And they said, okay, what's your point? And so I pulled up one of their charts, and there's 10 or 15 versions of this on their website. And essentially it says, if you want to get ahead, you got to get a 4-year degree or more. And because income goes up with it, unemployment comes down with it. And I said, well, I thought you were responsible for having the workforce we need. Yep. I thought you were responsible for the apprentice programs. Yep. I said, well, why don't we, right around the bachelor's degree, why don't we have the average income of people who've passed an apprenticeship? Because it's about the same as a bachelor's degree. And then the guidance counselors, the students, the parents, society would say, wow, apprenticeships. Hey, neat, no tuition. learn some real skills you can use around the house and the car and so on. Solid job. Yeah, and fortunately that's happening now. The enrollment in liberal arts degrees is down, and the enrollment in technical community colleges is up. The apprenticeship programs are doing well. It's still nothing like Germany. In Germany and Switzerland, 60% of the high school kids go into apprenticeships. And here, maybe 6% do. Right? Yeah. But at least we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And parents are saying, man, I think this makes a lot of sense, especially if the company will pay for the associate's degree that you get while you do the apprenticeship, and then maybe pay to go to school at night later and get your bachelor's degree in engineering or business, and have that practical, hands-on background behind it.
Yeah.
Obviously a good choice for a lot of people. Yet the government stands in the way by promoting things like this. I see advertisements for insurance companies. They'll pull up this chart and say, you got to have $1 million of insurance so you can send your kid to college. And so people see it, and they see it, and they see it, and they see it.
Yeah.
And so I'm still trying to get them to change it.
Yeah, I mean, I've and this is fresh in my mind as someone that just recently completed, with his wife, scratching out tuition checks for about 8 years. And I've noticed a trend with, that generation, 20 to 25, that they're really not interested in having that student debt. And so there are more, especially even just practically with my son's graduating classes, there's more electricians and machinists and welders there than, was, in previous generations. And so I think that that's happening, and people are just saying, I don't know the value in the college degree as much as there used to be, unless you're in a very specific kind of field, maybe engineering or medical or something like that. And that's really interesting to see that kind of trend happening. And I know primarily in overseas countries, right? You mentioned Germany. There's a decision path that happens in high school that really doesn't happen in most United States-based schools, right? Are you going to go to university, or are you going to take a technical path, right?
Yeah. And yet another piece of good news is in other countries that used to have excellent apprentice programs, their apprentice enrollment's falling off because more of their kids want to go to university and study liberal arts kind of fields. And even in China, there's a forecast of a 30 million worker shortfall in manufacturing because so many of the kids, they send so many kids to university, and the kids come out and they cannot find a university type job.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of taking a job in the factory like their parents did, they're doing something called lying flat, which is you sleep all day on the couch at your parents' apartment. So I always say Germany used to be here, we used to be way down here. We've come up a little bit, and the rest of the world's come down a little bit. So
Okay.
things are moving in the right direction.
All right. Well, that's a good trend to see too. So there'll be a different cycle in Europe and China. Excellent. So another topic we wanted to touch on was just innovation and reshoring. And so where do you see, innovation? That's a big focus of what we do here. Where does that intersect really well with reshoring? And maybe this is designed to cost processes or advanced manufacturing technologies or any kind of capability programs that are out there.
Yeah, we do see that the mix of industry that's coming back is heavily high tech and high to medium tech, and not very much low tech like apparel and furniture. It doesn't is it could. I mean, there's some nice automation coming along in both fields. They could make it very competitive here, but hasn't quite done so yet. So there's a lot of innovation happening that way. There's people working on dramatic increases in the automation of producing things. Like I'm talking to a company that the customer will call in, send in a CAD file, the system will automatically generate the CAM file, quote the part,
Yeah.
like within an hour or half an hour,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then the company, if you get the order and things are starting to move in the tooling and really quickly the parts being delivered, and so be able to, instead of having say the 6-week delivery out of China, have a couple of day delivery from Chicago or somewhere, and having a cost by cutting all that paperwork out and having one person monitoring 4 CNC machines, each with a robot, and having it run 3 shifts, the cost comes down to a point where the U.S. is essentially on par with China. So you put together the AI with the automation, with the other enabling softwares to make it happen, and not easy because at the same time the Chinese are doing the exact same thing and they're cutting their labor costs.
Yeah.
I always say it's like Alice in Wonderland. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay even.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, we've used a few of those services here on the parts and products that we design, and it's quite nice. The CAD file goes in, as you mentioned, within a few hours you have a part quote, and very, very short lead times. And so you can kind of feel how they've optimized their internal systems to be able to spin a part, and you can have parts in 48 hours in some engineered material, which is a really nice feature as you're starting to build out your systems. Excellent. All right, so we're going to go back to the TCO topic for a minute, and then just a couple additional questions or so. So for companies that are looking at reshoring, what are some common pitfalls or hidden opportunities these decision frameworks?
Yeah, first they only, based on our survey, only about 30% of them are using TCO. The rest are using price or landed cost or some other methodology, and if so, they're leaving significant opportunities that they could be taking advantage of. And I think that's number one. And there's a lot of talk about AI, and using AI in your supply chain and procurement. And if you have AI doing it and they're using the wrong measure and the wrong numbers and they're looking just at the price and not at the total cost of ownership, then you're very efficiently making the wrong decisions.
Yeah.
And yet the AI should be able to play a role in the TCO because some of those are fairly complex decisions.
Yeah.
And just keeping track of what the tariff is on that component, which could be changing every day. You could have the AI looking up the tariff and putting it into the calculations. Right? So there's a lot of things like that where AI can play an important role in making it happen.
Yeah. So that's a great segue into this topic of AI. And so I talk with a lot of senior executives that have been in this industry in different domains for 20, 30, 40 years, et cetera. You've seen many technologies that have evolved through the years. We probably have some parallels in how we've seen. I was someone that learned on a drafting board. Right. And so the evolution into CAD tools and then the lead time compression and the technologies. And so, what are your thoughts on AI as a tool for reshoring and manufacturing optimization? Do you see it as a big game changer that's going to disrupt? Or is it really the people elements in the organizations that's going to be most important, to be human centered? What do you think is most important for leaders to consider when it comes to artificial intelligence?
I'm not an expert, but
Sure.
the things I read say that the AI is only going to be successful if they're built on a foundation of people. Now, people have to know their industry. They have to know their data. They have to make sure the data is good. They have to set the priorities correctly for the AI. And if they do that, then I believe it'll work out well. But if you don't do that, if you either don't train your people well on the AI or you don't set the priorities and the data correctly, then I think there's some real risks in the process.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I need to use AI more.
So, yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is, as we kind of advocate, it's still people, it's your process, and then your technology is an amplifier. And so you got to kind of get those analog bits of the people and the process ironed out, and then you can implement an automation system or an AI system, and you'll be much more effective in that way. It becomes an amplifier for the people and the process.
Makes sense to me. I agree.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So we're going to wrap it up here. And so just kind of take a look at everything that we've talked about. What are some actionable recommendations, maybe, 1 to 5 that you think would give manufacturing and supply chain executives the ability to accelerate positive change, improve their reshoring competitiveness, and what would really help strengthen manufacturing over the next 5 to 6 years?
Workforce. Absolute number one. If you don't have them, you can't grow. You can't become more productive. You can't make the AI work. Recruiting and training, number one. And the other thing is when you do that, and reshore,
Mm-hmm.
you prove your loyalty to the workforce, the community, and the suppliers. So if I were a worker, would I rather work for a company that has announced, $100 million new factory, new equipment to make the product here, or one who's moving the stuff over to China or India and wonder if my job is going to be next. So I think the loyalty comes from reshoring. Get the right people, train them well, and show loyalty to them. And they won't stay forever, maybe like I tended to, but they'll stay a lot longer than otherwise. Use total cost of ownership. Again, it's free online at our website, and automate faster than China. Right now, China's labor productivity has been reported to be going up at 6% per year, and ours has averaged 0% for the last 15 years.
Wow.
And their wages are a third of ours. So when their wages are a third and they're increasing their product, and their productivity is probably as good or better than ours now, and theirs is going up at 6% and ours is flat, who's going to win that race? Not going to be us.
Yeah.
So you got to automate faster, get better people, automate faster than China does.
Gotcha. And so as we kind of cap the conversation, again, talk about the Reshoring Initiative and what you offer to organizations. And we're also going to talk about a survey that you have coming up soon on the closure date coming to that. What's the support that you can provide to those looking to do more reshoring?
I think first thing we provide is hope. So when I started this, most people said it wasn't feasible. Harry, don't bother. It's not going to work, kind of thing. And now anybody who reads anything about it, looks at our data, does whatever, say, oh, wow, it's working for thousands of companies. Maybe it'll work for us. It's worth 10 hours of analysis, kind of thing. Right? And then we have the TCO to help them do the analysis to see for which components it makes sense to bring the work back. We provide the data. We have a database of 8,000 companies that have done reshoring and FDI. So we sell that to big financial firms that look for opportunities where they can get ahead,
Yeah.
and to companies that want to say who are the new customers we should be selling to at those new factories.
Yeah.
And to universities and other groups for whom this is all kinds of groups. And so if your company might be better off with that kind of information, we're the only source of that data. We have a reshoring award, the National Metalworking Reshoring Award. So if you've reshored something and it's got a lot of metal in it, apply. We're in the midst of the 2026 National Reshoring Survey, and it's going to close on July 24, and we need a few more responses. And the survey works with both. It separates out what I call OEMs, like big companies, and supply chain companies, contract manufacturers. And so you can see here the URL for that survey. And one of the things we do with the results, we ask a lot of questions about what would cause you to bring the work back or what has caused you to do so. And we do our best to get that information into the White House to influence their decision. So anybody out there who feels neglected and thinks that their voice hasn't been heard, well, here's a chance for your aggregate voice to be heard. Get the survey, fill it out, and your voice will then be heard.
Excellent. All right, Harry. Well, I'm really grateful for the time and the enriching conversation. And as always, I learn a lot and always am appreciative of people that take on an initiative that maybe other people were telling them that's not going to work. But you've kind of proven that out in what you've shared with us today. So very grateful for that.
Appreciate it. It's the right thing to do, and it's nice to have your friends appreciate it.
How best can folks keep in touch?
Yeah, so I'm Harry Moser, so harry.moser@reshorenow.org.
Excellent.
That's the email address, and I'd love to hear about your successes reshoring or your opportunities to reshore, or better ideas on how to convince companies to reshore. Any help you want to give. We even take donations for those who want us to do more.
We'll have in the conversation notes, we'll have all the relevant links to the survey, and they need to complete that by July 24th, correct?
July 20th, yeah.
Excellent. All right, Harry, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Jon.
And look forward to connecting again soon.
Bye, everybody.